record, and I'm going to introduce Ken Donnelly, our speaker today. So Ken has been applying behavioral psychology to improve sustainability for over 25 years. He has developed behavior change programs in Canada, the US, the UK, and the Caribbean. And for almost 10 years, Ken has been focused on disrupting invasive species pathways, working in Canada and the US. Ken also conducts behavior change workshops and publishes a weekly newsletter providing the most recent tips, techniques, and news. Ken is president of Beyond Attitude Consulting, based in beautiful Nova Scotia, Canada. So with that, I will welcome Ken Donnelly and turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Belle. Thanks everyone for being here. A pleasure to be joining the NAISMA webinar series. I've watched or listened to several of them, and they're really good. If you're not a member of NAISMA, it's not expensive to join, and you can get access to all of those recorded webinars from this series. There's some really good stuff there. But let me get on to this. I'm going to talk to you about applying behavioral psychology to invasive species. And I'm going to go through the steps of the application of behavioral psychology to different things that involve human behavior. And this is the important thing here, is we're not trying to change the behavior of the invasive species themselves, but whenever there is a pathway that involves humans, there are human behaviors that are involved. Sometimes we want to change existing behaviors and get people to adopt better ones, or perhaps we want people just to adopt the behavior at all. And I'm going to talk about that through, I'm just a second here, I'm having a bit of a problem. There we go. Okay. So whenever I start my live workshops, or when I speak at conferences and that sort of thing, I always start the same way, and I talk about blood donation. And I ask people if they think that blood donation is a good thing. And whenever I ask, everybody puts up their hand and they say, yes, blood donation is a good thing, virtually everybody. And I've been doing this for 20 years now. So there's many thousands of people that have indicated that they believe that blood donation is a good idea. So I assume from this informal survey that virtually everybody believes, they have the attitude that blood donation is a good thing. And I then ask people, I just point to people in the audience. It's a bit of an icebreaker, and I say, well, you, sir, why do you think blood donation is a good idea? And the person may say, well, it may save a life. And then I ask a woman on the other side of the room, and I say, look, what do you think about blood donation? Why is it a good idea? And she may say, well, it's a renewable resource. And people shout out very readily, on top of mind, the advantages of donating blood. And then I say, okay, that's great. Everybody thinks blood donation is important, and everybody knows all the reasons why blood donation is important. Now put up your hand if you've given blood in the last 3 months, and the last 6 months, and the last year. And I go back to 5 years, and there's always a smattering of hands in the crowd, but not a lot of them. And that's because only about 3.5% of Americans donate blood. It's actually about 3.8% that in the United States. In Canada, it's where I live, it's about 3.5%. Now, not everybody can donate blood. There's only about 50% of Canadians, for instance, that can. And in the United States, it's about 40% of people that can donate blood. Similar restrictions in other countries too. But I always, if I'm speaking in another country, I always take a look at what the blood donation is, and it's usually between 3.5% to 4%, no matter where I go. That's been true in the Caribbean, in the UK, and in other places. In Australia, I came across the same sort of number when I was speaking there in June. So we have a gap there, and this is the most important thing to understand, that the most important takeaway from my talk today is that just because somebody has the right attitude and the right awareness about something doesn't mean that they're going to take on the behavior. They're not going to follow up with the action. This is really important. It's the most crucial thing about my talk, is we can't make an assumption just because somebody thinks it's a good thing to do that they're going to do it. In fact, psychologists have a name for it, the attitude behavior gap, where somebody has the right attitude but they don't follow up with the related behavior. There's other names for it, the intention action gap or the value action gap, where a person holds certain values, but they actually don't follow up on them. And we can probably all think of things like, that we want to exercise more, we want to diet, or we want to call a loved one more often, and we just don't follow up and do it. That's the attitude behavior gap. It's very prevalent. And it's the biggest thing that stops our programs from working when we're doing communications programs, no matter if it's an invasive species or it's energy conservation or water quality issues. Doesn't matter. Just often the problem is that we try and convince people that to have the right attitude and the knowledge, and we assume that the behavior is going to happen, but we can't make that assumption. So now it's still important to have the right attitude and awareness, because you're not going to be able to get somebody to clean, drain, and dry their boat, for instance, if they don't think it's important to clean, drain, and dry their boat, or they don't think that invasive species are an issue, or they don't know anything about invasive species and the risks that come with them. So you do have to have the right attitude and awareness, and you have to foster that in people, but you can't stop there assuming that, oh, okay, well, now I've convinced them it's a good thing to do, they're all going to do it, because they won't. So I'm going to use Play Clean Go as a key example throughout this presentation, just sort of so we've got some consistency, but I'm also going to throw in some examples of AIS and a couple of others as well. And it's important, as I said before, to recognize that these principles work for many different things. When we're designing behavior change programs, there are different steps that we take. First one is research, and then we try and identify the barriers that exist, and we promote the behaviors, and we secure commitments, and we provide reminders, and we try and develop social norms or a culture and peer pressure to get people to have impacts on others. And I'm going to talk about each of those. But the important thing to understand here is this innovation adoption curve. I don't know if you've seen this before, but it's a bell curve, and in the green underneath the curve that represents the total population, any population of the world. It could be the population of people who hike. It could be population of people who camp. If you're trying to get them not to move firewood, whatever the issue might be, that they're all under there. And on the left-hand side, you have what are known as innovators, and on the right-hand side, you have laggards, and in between, you have different people. So there's a spectrum, and essentially, on the left-hand side, those are the people that are the easiest to get to adopt their behavior, and on the right-hand side, those are the hardest. Now, the easy ones are called innovators, and they're the people who are just going to do it. You just tell them that they should be washing their boots, or brushing their boots rather, when they come off the hiking trail, and they're just going to do it because perhaps they work in invasive species, or they happen to work for parks. They feel very strongly about that as part of their own feeling about themselves, and they're just going to do it. Early adopters come next, and it gets more and more difficult as you go along to get more people doing it. The tools that I'm going to talk about today help us move from the left to the right along the innovation adoption curve and get more and more people doing it. I should say that, those laggards can be tough, and you can't really expect that you're going to get 100% of people, but you can get more and more as time goes on, and we'll talk about that. So I'm not going to spend a lot of detail on research here, or a lot of time rather on research. But it is important to identify and remove the barriers to performing behaviors, why people aren't performing the behavior you want them to. And you also, when you want to do some research, to establish a baseline of how many people are actually doing what you want them to do now and how many aren't. So you can measure against that later to see how well your program is working or has worked. Excuse me. So the research methods that are usually used are literature reviews. Now, fortunately, we're getting more and more literature reviews in invasive species. We just conducted one last year for Minnesota DNR. There's a bunch of other ones out there. There's tons of them in issues like waste management. But we're getting more in invasive species, and that's good because you might be able to find one where and not conduct a literature review yourself. But the nice thing about literature reviews is you can pretty well do a Google search and you can find tons of articles about invasive species done by researchers at universities, people like myself who are practitioners, that kind of thing. You also want to do surveys if you can. Surveys are a fairly big undertaking. However, surveys are also, you can ask questions of a group as small as, well, under 400, and you can get a feel for the number of people, the percentage of people that will take certain actions, what's stopping them, and all of that sort of thing, just by, in a much larger population through extrapolation. You can do focus groups where you get smaller groups of people into a group, maybe 8 to 10 people. I usually invite 12, and you get somewhere between 8 and 10 because people don't show up. But you can talk to them. Focus groups can be a bit expensive, especially if you're paying people to go to them. But observation is always a good thing. If you sit down in a lawn chair and watch people coming in and out of a lake, or going into a trail and off a trail, you can observe what's going on. And observation is, well, observed data is a lot more accurate than data that is self-reported, because people tend to answer with social bias, meaning that they'll tell a researcher what they think the researcher wants to hear, or what makes them look in the best light. So, but you can't do all of these things, or often can't do all of these things because it's pretty expensive and it takes a lot of time. But what you should do is as much as you can with the budget available. Don't skip the research. Don't make the mistake of assuming that you know just because you've been working in this area for a long time. I've been doing surveys for almost 30 years now, and I can tell you there isn't one time that I've conducted a survey and didn't learn anything. I always learn something. So do the research, and we want to find out barriers and benefits. So do people know about invasive species and the risks? If they don't know about it, that's going to be a barrier to getting things done. If they don't understand the risks, they don't know what an invasive species is, well then they're very unlikely to take action to prevent it because they don't see any reason not to. So that's an area where you will have to increase the awareness and attitude in order to get people to participate in your behavior. Ask people straight up, why don't people brush their boots? Why don't they wash ATVs and other equipment? Why do people move firewood? Like, why are you moving firewood? Why don't you just burn local? Ask the questions. And sometimes you ask them, why don't they move firewood? Or you might say, why do people move firewood? Asking in a third-party way often gets people to, gives them the freedom to feel that they can answer more truthfully, because it doesn't reflect directly on them. But do not make assumptions. You have to determine the actual barriers, and then you have to remove them. Removing the barriers and making things more convenient is the most important thing you can do in getting people to change their behaviors. So I said that the most important takeaway from this was the gap between attitude and awareness and the actual behaviors. The most important thing you can do when you're actually implementing a CBSM program is to remove those barriers that you've identified and make it more convenient for people to do what you're telling them to. And benefits are really important too. So what we do when we're researching is we'll say, let's just say on brushing boots, we'll say, when you come off of, go on a trail or come off a trail, do you brush your boots? And if the person says yes, we say, that's great. Why do you brush your boots? And we record what they say. Maybe they'll say, well, I like clean boots. Maybe they'll say, I don't want to spread invasive species. Maybe they'll say, because I see other people doing it, so it's important. Whatever it is, we want to know what motivates those people who do brush boots because then we might be able to use those same motivators to push some buttons in other people to get them to do it. But if they say, no, I never brush my boots, we say, why not? Because we want to know why not. What are the barriers? What's preventing them from doing it? Perhaps they'll say that they don't have the equipment that they need to brush boots, or they forget. So we ask those questions and we record them, and that's essentially how we find out what the barriers are and the benefits, which are often called motivators as well. So I like to look at the barriers as friction, because that, for my simple mind, this makes sense to me. And pretend that person is pushing a heavy fridge up a ramp to get it into a new apartment or home they're moving into. Barriers are like friction. They make the adoption of a new behavior difficult. And the more barriers they are, and the tougher the barriers are, or the more persistent they are, that heavier that fridge is, and it makes it harder to push it uphill. So removing those barriers is the most important step to getting people to adopt your preferred behavior. And if you can remove the barriers and make it as easy to do what you want them to do, then there's no more friction. There's nothing that's pushing against them to get that fridge moved. It's like putting wheels under it. But if you actually make it easier to perform the behavior than the alternative, then you can actually really get them to accept the behavior and perform the behavior because it's easier. And a really simple example of that is, I've done a lot of work in waste management and in office recycling, and people in offices that are tasked with trying to get people to recycle the paper and the cans and all of those things that can be recycled. They often say, what they'll do is they'll put perhaps a recycling bin in the photocopy room or in the lunchroom in a central area, and they get people to walk. They want people to walk to that central area and throw their excess paper into that bin, or their cans or glasses, or cans or glass containers into the bin in the lunchroom. But people sitting at their desks still have the garbage cans sitting right beside them. So it's easier to put the recyclables into the garbage can that's right by their legs than to get up and walk to the container, the recycling container. So you want to make things at least as easy or even easier to do the new behavior. So what often happens in offices is they put the recycling bin next to the person, and they put the garbage bin a little further away to make it inconvenient to go to throw recyclables in the garbage. We did a study in 2018 across Canada. We had about, I think it was 1,860 participants, and we did a bunch of outdoor activities. On barriers to brushing boots, we said, do you brush your boots? And for those people who said, why not? We said, they told us that knowledge was a problem, knowledge of what to do, knowledge about invasive species. They said that they would forget to do it, and they said that they lacked the equipment. There was lack of knowledge, lack of equipment. You can see the size of the words there represent how often things came up. So knowledge, remembering to do it, and having the equipment were pretty significant barriers. Those were the ones that came up the most. So if you want to remove those, well, here's a pretty good example. The boot brush station with a sign on it. It helps with the knowledge, because while they're brushing their boots, they're reading the sign with the pretty pictures, and they're learning about invasive species and why they should be doing this. It has the equipment right there. They don't have to remember a little brush or try and wipe it off with a credit card or something, because they're just learning about invasive species. The equipment's right there, and it reminds them. They've come off the trail, and it's right there. They'd have to walk right past that. So it reminds them. They won't forget anymore. So when you're developing solutions, what you want to do, as I said before, the most important thing is to remove those barriers. Here's another example. This is from an aquatic invasive species program we worked on quite a few years ago. And this was the fellow there with the pressure washer is showing those anglers how to clean, drain, and dry the boat. And they don't know anything about cleaning, draining, drying the boats, or they didn't know anything about it beforehand. So he's showing them what to do and explaining it to them. And he's using, you can't see the tank or the pump, but he's hooked up to a portable power washer cleaning station that we had there. So you're removing the barrier and making it very easy. Alternatively, you can stand there and say, well, how about if you go to a car wash, one of those ones with the hose, and wash your vehicle and wash your boat and trailer on the way back? Probably not going to happen. So once you've identified the barriers and you've removed them, then you want to promote those behaviors. So you really want to push the behavior. You're not just going to assume that the behavior is going to happen because you've made them knowledgeable. You're actually going to promote the behaviors. So put the signage up that we typically use. Come clean, leave clean for brushing your boots. Or like this sticker that was used in British Columbia Aquatic Invasive Species project I worked on. It tells people exactly what to do to clean, drain, and dry their boats. So really promote those behaviors. And remember, though, that it's going to be easier when people go to do it because you've removed the barriers. And the next thing is securing commitments. Now, commitments are really important. In our cultures, people want to be seen to be consistent with what they say. If you say that you're going to do something and you don't do it, that's frowned upon in our culture. So you look bad. So if we can get people to make a commitment, then they're much more likely, and this has been proven time and time again in studies, that people are much more likely to adopt the behavior. And part of that, a big part of it, and this is the behavioral science perspective, is that people change their self-perception. So if I tell you that I am going to clean my boots every time that I get on a trail, I'm going to feel badly if I don't, because I've changed my own self-perception. I consider myself somebody that is going to do that. If I say to you that I'm not going to move firewood, I'm just going to get firewood locally at the campsite whenever I go camping, then I'm very unlikely to actually move the firewood. I might, but I'm much less likely to do it if I've made a commitment, even if you're not around to see me. Whether clean, drain, dry, whatever it might be, washing your ATV down, using weed-free gravel, weed-free forage, whatever it is, once somebody's made a commitment, they're much more likely to do it. So we want to get people to make commitments to undertake those behaviors that we want to foster. So how do you do that? Well, NAISMA on their website for Play Clean Go has a pledge form, and you can go to the website and create a pledge, and take the pledge rather. This one shows ATVs, but it has a sliding carousel, I guess they're called, a carousel of images of different Play Clean Go related behaviors, and people can take the pledge and say that they're going to do those sorts of things: remove plants, animals, and mud from their boots, gear, pets, and vehicle, clean your gear before entering and leaving the recreation site, stay on designated roads and trails, that kind of thing. So if people take that pledge, they're much more likely to do it. Now, it can be difficult to get people to take the pledge online. It's much better to be able to do it face-to-face if possible. Here's an example. Those are the same two guys that were on that boat. And, frankly, looking at those guys, I wouldn't have thought that perhaps they'd be even willing to stop when the person asked them to, but they're clearly, they were clearly engaged when they were on the boat. And what's going on right there is the fellow with their back turned to you, he said to the gentleman who owns the boat, he said, okay, well, I showed you how to clean, drain, and dry your boat. You know how to do it now? And the guy said, yes. And he said, that's great. Will you clean, drain, and dry your boat from now on so we can stop aquatic hitchhikers? And the fellow says, yes. So he's made a verbal commitment, which is great. We know that somebody makes a commitment, that's much stronger. They're much more likely to do it than if they haven't. But we try and climb the ladder of commitment, as I call it. So while that person, what that guy's doing is he's signing his name, adding his name to a list of people that day that have committed to invasive species, to cleaning invasive species off their boat. So he's making a written commitment now. A written commitment is much, much stronger than a verbal commitment. But he just told the guy, when he asked him, will you do it from now on? He said, he said yes. He said, okay. And the fellow just said, okay, here's a list of all the people that are saying yes. Would you add your name to the list? The guy, as soon as he starts writing his name, he's making a written commitment, whether he knows it or not, whether he realizes it or not. So that's much more powerful. But what we do is, right beside where he's writing his name, we put a little checkbox. And while he's writing his name, that fellow's going to say to him, that's great, you know, really glad you're going to do this. We're trying to convince a lot of people to do it, and we want to publish the names or the initials or whatever of the people who have agreed to clean, drain, and dry their boats. If you check off that box, you're allowing us to use your name in our communications pieces. And if the person checks it off, they've just made a public commitment. And public commitments are much stronger than written commitments, which are much stronger in turn than verbal commitments. So that's how we climb the ladder of commitments. And the more people we can get giving a public commitment, the better. So we go out and we get as many commitments as we can. Then we provide reminders. And reminders, I'll go through this fairly quickly, but reminders are, you know, turn the lights off, turn the last one out, turns the coffee pot off, whatever they might be. They're very simple and effective. But the most important thing to do is to be close in time and space where the behavior is to be done. A few months ago, I was talking with some people about invasive species, aquatic invasive species, and somebody suggested that we should get fridge magnets done up, reminding people to clean, drain, and dry their boats. Well, that's really good to have a reminder to clean, drain, and dry your boat if you store your boat in your kitchen. If the reminder is a magnet on your fridge, if your boat's right there in the kitchen, that's great. But most people don't do that. So you need to have that reminder in the place where you want the behavior to be done at the time you want it done. So we always say the right information at the right time in the right place. And here's another example is you want a boot brush station right there when people are coming off the trail. And this one is clear and simple. It's in place where the action should be taken, right there at the head of the trail, provides the information in the right place at the right time. And it's a reminder that supports other elements. So if somebody has said, I will clean my boots, they've made that commitment to you, this reminder supports them of the commitment, as well as removing those barriers like not having the equipment. Same thing with a sign that's at a boat launch, reminding people to clean, drain, and dry their boats. And finally, I'm going to talk about developing a culture. Now, cultures or social norms are based on peer pressure, and they're very effective. In our culture, this isn't true in the UK, but in North America, generally, if you walk into a elevator, you turn around and you face the door, and you don't look at anybody else, just like those people aren't. You might look at your shoes, you might look at the numbers going up and down, because I don't know why people look at the numbers going up and down. It's not like they're going to suddenly go down, or at least you hope not, when they were going up. So but this is a very powerful social norm. And if one of those fellows was to turn around and look at the three people behind him, one of the fellows in the front, they would be extremely uncomfortable. So social norms are very powerful. We can get people to change behaviors. It wasn't that many years ago when the proper behavior for coughing was to cough into your fist. And then people realized that, well, you cough into your fist and then you shake hands with somebody or you hand them a pencil or whatever, you're transmitting viruses and bacteria. So now we cough into our elbow. So before, say a kid would cough, the mother or father would say, cough into your hand, cough into your hand. Now a kid coughs into your hand. So what are you doing coughing into your hand? Cough into your elbow. So we can change the behaviors, but it's the peer pressures is what's doing it. And when the social norm is to do something else, like at one time people didn't wear seatbelts even though they put them in the cars. It took a long time to get people to change their behavior so they would wear those seatbelts. Breaking social norms can be very, very difficult too. But the good thing is that if you can establish a new social norm of performing the behavior that you want done, then it's much more likely to stick, and that will help move people along that spectrum of behavior that I showed you before, and get people over to the early adopters and past that to the late adopters, and maybe even into the laggards, because people don't want to be doing something that is considered to be the wrong thing to do. A clean, drain, dry sign, I showed this slide before as a reminder for people to do it, but it's also a social norm, because if somebody comes out of the water and there's other people around with their boats and trailers, and they drive right by that clean, drain, dry sign without cleaning and draining and drying their boat, it's going to be difficult because there's a lot of peer pressure from the other people around to do the right thing. So that helps create a social norm as well. So finally, the last thing I just want to talk about here before I wrap up and answer questions is about target audiences. One thing, marketers often segment audiences for messaging, and that's really important because we know that messages to even to genders can more effective messages, or some messages can be more effective for males and some more for females, and some for older people and younger people and all, that kind of thing. We have to be a little wary of segmenting too much, because we did that survey in Canada that I mentioned before, and what we were doing was talking to people that were active outdoors. And if you take a look at the data, as I have, you will see that many of those hikers that we talked about cleaning their boots, are also gardeners, or they're campers, and you want to be talking to them about firewood as well, and hanging baskets for the gardeners, and canoeists, and clean, draining, and drying their boats. It's not just the people with power boats. Well, so there's a lot of overlap there, and if you can convince somebody who hikes to clean, drain, and clean, drain, dry. If you can convince somebody that hikes to brush their boots because it's important because of AIS, then you're probably going to want to say, so do you do any camping? And if they say yes, you say, great, you're already going to take important steps for hiking, but there's a big problem with bringing firewood long distances, because we can have forest pests that can just wipe out a forest, and they can be in the area. So they can wipe out a forest in the area that you take it to. So can we count on you to source your wood locally? Or can we count on you, if you're a canoeist or a kayaker, to really empty that boat out and make sure that you get all of the water out before you put it in another body of water? And once you get them to commit to one behavior, you can ask about others. So thanks very much. It was fun to be here and to help support this great series of webinars that NAISMA has been putting on. I did put this on here. I'll leave that screen up. And I do a behavior change Friday email blast. There's subscribers from all around the world. And I try and get it out every Friday. If you're in the States, you can text Friday News, as it says, to number 44222, and you'll get signed up for the behavior change newsletter. Other countries, and I'm sure there's people from other countries on the call, just go to www.beyondattitude.com and hit the subscribe button in the top right. You can see it from the screen grab that I put on there. And that will get you into the newsletter. And if you don't like it, you can always unsubscribe. And with that, Belle, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ken. That was a fantastic webinar. I think I've seen you give at least two other presentations, but this may have been my favorite. I think the message is perfect. And first, I want to just say a couple of notes because of why I think it's perfect. Many of you know, but maybe some of you don't know, that the Play Clean Go campaign was developed with community-based social marketing principles, um, very much as part of the development and the strategy, excuse me, of the campaign. So Ken's message here, resonates very strongly with those of us who are spreading the Play Clean Go campaign and looking for ways to grow its reach. And it continues. The community-based social marketing principles and these behavior change principles are very much in our minds and in our strategy as we develop new resources. So thank you, Ken. This was just fantastic. And so we do have a couple of questions already on the question tab, and I'm going to start to run through them. So as I start to ask the questions to Ken, think about anything else you'd like to ask, and we'll try to get as many questions in as we can in the next 10 to 15 minutes. So we have a question from Jean Scherer, who asks, or says, personally, I find pledge cards annoying. What about something like a whiteboard or similar that people could sign for all to see at the launch event, etc.? Well, that's a great question. And in fact, just recently, Play Clean Go has launched something similar. We developed, actually, we modeled a sticky note based on something that Minnesota DNR had developed. And it is a pledge. It's a sticky note pledge with the Play Clean Go brand. And it says basically, I pledge to clean my gear every time I enter and leave a recreation site. If you're interested in ordering those, they're available on the Play Clean Go order store. If you go to playcleango.org and click on the Order Products button at the top, you'll get right there. So there's a solution there. Great, great question. Next question is, can we get the steps list again? So Ken, I don't know if you want to scroll back.
There, and maybe people can take pictures of that with their
Yeah,
phones or something.
you could do a screenshot. Yeah.
Bill, can I just
Yeah,
address that first question
sure.
quickly?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, pledge cards. There's issues with pledge cards. I've done a lot of work in waste management, and that seems like a waste of resources to me. However, they do work, but there's better choices. I really think that, like I mentioned, one way of doing the public behaviors, the public commitments. Another way is just to give people things that they can wear, like a hat. It's a Play Clean Go hat, or a Brush My Boots hat, or what we do use often is those vinyl cling stickers, and we'll put that on the windshields of boats when people pledge. And so that stays there. It reminds them to do it, of their own commitment, but also reminds people that see the boat that there's other people that are doing it. And so it becomes a public commitment by the person that has the sticker on there. We've used them extensively in anti-idling campaigns when we try and get people to stop idling their vehicles while they're waiting to pick somebody up and that sort of thing. So there's a whole bunch of ways to do public commitments that are better than those pledge cards, that's for sure.
Great. Thanks, Ken. Next question from Amy Michael. Where do we go to join NAISMA? Great question. You can go to naisma.org and click on the membership tab, right at the membership menu right at the top. And that'll give you some options to join. Jackie Lally says, great info, thanks. Question, given that lack of knowledge is the biggest barrier to action in this area, what does behavioral psychology tell us about how to get them over that barrier? What knowledge specifically? For example, the nature of the problem, consequences, what to do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So quite often people develop communications materials, I think, too early. And before you create communications materials, you should find out what those barriers are, because that could be some of the stuff that you're talking about in there. And you also want to know what the level of knowledge is. So maybe in the population, there's very little knowledge about the issue. Or there might be quite a bit, but there's certain spots that there's holes in the knowledge, for instance, so that you might want to address. Now, the key thing is you have to look at that knowledge as being a something like a predictor of the behavior, or something that needs to be in there, like understanding the risk, or knowing that there's invasive species like zebra mussels in some of the lakes that you're going boating or angling in, or knowing that using certain types of bait can lead to invasive species. So there's key things like that that you really need. You should be able to identify. You can also identify when you survey what those holes are and plug them. If you do have a communications, if you've developed communications materials and you already have a good communications, you've got stickers or whatever you're using and that kind of thing, you may want to review them and see if you can plug those holes and incorporate some commitments or text like, 60% or 80% of your neighbors are doing this, that kind of thing, in order to bring those communications materials along into actually changing behaviors and not just addressing those barriers.
Great, thanks, Ken. Great, next question is from Tim Campbell. Hi, Ken, great presentation. In your experience, how often are organizations utilizing CBSM and other social science? Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. How often are organizations utilizing CBSM and other social science approaches to their maximum potential to address environmental issues?
Okay, great. Hi, Tim. Thanks for asking the question. Probably see you in New York at Saratoga Springs for NASMA, I would imagine. Tim, as you know, I think that, because Tim's very involved in aquatic invasive species and he uses CBSM himself, there's a lot of places that aren't using it. I find there's more and more are incorporating CBSM into invasive species work, but it's fairly new. I got involved in the last 8 years or so, compared to some things like waste management, energy conservation, water quality work, which I've worked on for 2 decades to 3 decades, almost 3 decades. So, but I have seen that in the last 4 or 5 years, there's a lot more communications, or behavior change work or community-based social marketing work being done in invasive species, in all kinds of invasive species, aquatic, terrestrial, horticultural, all of the different elements. I was just in Australia and in June, speaking at their biodiversity symposium, and I was blown away by how much is being done there and in New Zealand. So it's growing rapidly, but based on the number of people that contact me and say that they're only learning about behavior change in CBSM, it certainly has a long way to go.
And Ken, just sort of related to that point, I think some of the discussions I've had with some of our partners recently is what is the trick to breaking down the barrier into the smaller pieces, the smallest behavior, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, but that's challenging, I think, to breaking down the behavior into the actual trigger point.
Yeah, it's for those people who have taken community-based social marketing training, you'll know about these end state behaviors and indivisible behaviors, and that has caused a lot of confusion on the side of implementation. Just as an example, I got a call from a lady a couple of years ago in Canada, and she was tasked with getting people in apartment buildings to recycle in a place in the province of Manitoba. And she said, I've taken the training and we can get people to recycle, we believe. We know what the behaviors are, but we break it down into component behaviors. And those component behaviors, if we promote them, like getting bins into into common areas in recycling and that sort of thing. That, or sorry, in apartment buildings or into common areas or whatever. That's not a behavior that actually is the recycling. And she was just at wit's end saying, I don't know how I can move forward. We can't identify it as any behavior at all that's actually recycling. And that's confusion based on this idea of having end state or indivisible behaviors. That is important, but let me try and explain this a little bit better, because I've probably been confusing so far. But if I want you to turn down the thermostat on your hot water heater, because that will reduce energy consumption. And I say, go in there, turn down the thermostat from 132 to 128 degrees. That's fine, but that's a behavior, but it's not an indivisible behavior, because you may have to go find a screwdriver and take that panel off. Go to before that, go to your electrical panel and shut off the power to it so you don't electrocute yourself. Identify what the thermostat looks like, make the adjustment. You might have to go get a pair of glasses because it's usually hard to read them. There's a whole bunch of different things that you might have to do. Similar thing with when you ask people to change the faucet so to be a low flow faucet. They may have to get a wrench. They may not have one. They might not have the strength to change them. So you have to identify those indivisible behaviors and end state behaviors and remove them as barriers. That's why when you buy some furniture from IKEA, they normally throw in that crappy little Allen key that you're going to need, because they know that if people don't have Allen keys, they're not going to be able to assemble it. So, but the behavior in the case of the hot water tank that you still want to promote is to go and turn down that thermostat, even though it's not the indivisible behavior. I hope that may be really confusing to people that have not taken the CBSM training, but for those that have, I hope it helps to clarify that concern.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I think it did. All right, next question is from Prabir Roy. Behavior and attitude gap is highly variable with education, social value, individual experience, etc. Do you have any comments on this in relation to varied demographic response to invasive species?
Yeah, that's true. It's also, there's many factors, right? There's also factors related to experience in, say, with gardeners and hanging baskets and things like that can have invasive species in them. Whether if you're a new gardener, you haven't had that much involvement, and you might just think, well, it's the fall now, I'll just dump this in hanging basket in over the fence of my yard, and hanging baskets often have invasive species because they're very rigorous and they're harder to kill if you don't water them. So we do ask, when we do surveys, we do ask for demographics, and we do check to see, we do cross-referencing to check to see if there are indications that some of those demographics may be predictors or may have an effect on whether or not people adopt the behaviors. And then we may target our communications and particularly the change or removal of barriers and gathering commitments based on what we found with those demographic differences.
Super, thanks, Ken. Next question, got time for a couple more. From Michael Spinar, do you have any specific suggestions for addressing the laggards in adopting a behavior?
I said in Australia that those are the people that you want to shoot, but I was just kidding. They can be very difficult. Let me just give you an example. When when I was doing waste management work in the 90s and the 2000s, a lot of people were, because CBSM was a new thing at the time, behavior change was a new thing, and a lot of people were really wound up about getting people to recycle and getting everybody to recycle. and getting everybody to separate their organics, like they started doing in 1999 here where I live in Nova Scotia. And a lot of the people at that time were elderly people who said that felt that they were going to have a hard time getting their waste to the curb if it was separated in organics into an organic bin, even though it had wheels on it, and into recycling containers. And I said, you know, those people, if you're 75 or 80 years old, you're not going to be around that much longer. But for somebody that's 20, they're going to be around for another 50 or 60 or more years. And they've got a lot, they're going to have a lot more impact. So if you're not getting somebody because they're not, and they're not going to be around for a while, they concentrate more on the others. I think if you can accept that you're not going to get 100%, then don't beat yourself up over those others that aren't doing it. For one thing, like with invasive species on Play Clean Go, if you get 75 or 80% of the people cleaning their booths, like, don't beat yourself silly trying to get the other 20%. Move over to the people that are moving their firewood around and try and get a good portion of them. It'll have more impact. You'll get more benefit for your efforts because of it. But that said, the key thing for some of those laggards is peer pressure. Eventually, when they see everybody else around them doing the right thing, it becomes very difficult for them not to do the right thing as well. Here in Nova Scotia, a few years back, we went to clear garbage bags. And that means that the garbage man can, or woman, the garbage person, the collection person, can look at the bag and see if there's recyclables or organics that shouldn't be in the garbage bag. And if they are there, then they'll leave it behind. And if you come home from work and your garbage that you put out in the morning is still there when everybody else has picked up, that's shame. And at first, we saw quite a bit of that. There's hardly any of that happens anymore because of peer pressure. The person may not think it's important to recycle, but they don't want to look like the person that doesn't recycle, the only person that doesn't recycle on their street. So developing a culture helps with that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay, I think we'll do two last questions here. One from Meredith Bean. Are you using social media and hashtags as a way to accrue pledges or commitments toward the desired behavior change? I mean, I can speak from Play Clean Go, we absolutely are, and that actually raises a question for me. So Ken, I'm going to give you two questions in one. As a behavior change specialist, would you consider these online pledges to be part of this? I mean, yeah, the social media and the hashtags and the pledges toward, would you count those as these sort of secure commitments as you define them?
Yeah, absolutely. They are. If I take a picture of myself washing my boat and say I'm doing this to stop invasive species and post it to Instagram with a hashtag, like, I'm much more likely to do it going forward because it's been out there. As an example, I at one time I used to be on television, on our local breakfast television show once a week, doing environmental stuff. And a lot of that was waste management because it was back at the time when we were doing a lot of waste management work. And man, if I was out in a public place and I had finished drinking, say, a plastic bottle of water, which was more okay then than it is now, but there was no way I was putting that in the garbage in front of a whole bunch of people that might know me from television, right? So that public commitment of being an environmentalist on television made sure that I was very careful of my behaviors. So, you know, to a lesser extent, those hashtags and pictures on Instagram and all of those, they are commitments. They do create a social norm, and they're a great strategy. Like it's inexpensive, and if you can get it to go viral, you're getting a lot of bang for very little cost.
Excellent. Good. Great. We'll keep doing it. All right, last question. Have you been involved with an evaluation of compliance of commitments for invasive species prevention? If so, what types of methods have you used to evaluate the commitments and over what timescales?
Well, that's a really good question. I've done them with observations. So we've done programs where we've had observations at the beginning of a program. We've done it in waste management as well as aquatic invasive species, are two examples I can think of offhand. And then we ran a program and evaluated after. So on timescales, the timescales in those two examples were both pretty short. So it was not long after we did what I call the interventions, when we showed people what they should be doing, spoke to them face to face and gathered commitments, that we then went back and we observed behavior and counted up. One was waste management, for instance, and we were able to just go out and count to see how many people had started the behaviors. And we had another group that was a control group that they didn't get any behavior change action in their neighborhood, so we were able to compare against that and all of that. But it was done shortly after. So what we were able to do at that time was show that securing the commitments and showing the behaviors and putting up some reminders and that sort of thing worked, but it didn't measure the effectiveness of culture change. And for culture change to be measured, you have to look a lot, or the effect of the culture change to be measured, you have to look at a much longer time frame. So when we do surveys at the beginning of a program for our clients, we always design them with the consideration that in maybe 5, 7, 10 years from now, that client may run that survey again. And so we have things in there where we can measure the attitude and awareness and the reported adoption of behaviors. If it's observed data, we show them, we write down how we gathered this data so that later on they can do the same thing again and have a really good measurement. And I think that's really important. Unfortunately, with government funding for projects, it's usually the funding is only available for the fiscal year. So they want the evaluation done in the same fiscal year, and that often means that you're evaluating just too early. And also, unfortunately, and I think this is part of, behind of this question is, there's a lot of programs that are implemented and there's no evaluation at all. And we need more evaluation. It's just that quite often the money's not available to pay for that.
Interesting. Thank you, Ken. All right. Well, I think that'll be our last question. So Ken, I want to thank you again for this excellent webinar. You've definitely confirmed that the direction we are all taking, those of us using these strategies, are the right way. And stopping invasive species absolutely requires behavioral psychology. So thank you so much. One final note that this webinar was recorded and will be posted on NAISMA's member portal. So if you are a NAISMA member, you will have access to this. And if you are not, visit us at naisma.org, click on membership and sign up. This will also be posted on the Play Clean Go password, not password protected, but the Play Clean Go partner resources. So with that, thank you again for joining us, everyone. This was a great webinar. Thank you again, Ken, and have a great rest of your week.